This training video on remote learning best practices is going to focus on engagement this week. So for our content for this video, we're going to review some best practices for daily virtual classroom and content engagement based on your remote learning environment, as well as your technology integration experience. So we'll cover some no tech, low tech, and medium high tech options, and then we will also tell you where to find the webinar resources for today's session. So daily engagement is really checking in with your students every day. If you are falling in the no tech category and you're using resource packets with your students, we talked a little bit in our first webinar, some takeaways for getting up and running with remote learning. And one of the options when you have your schedule sent out to your students is to use check boxes. And that way, on a daily basis, they're checking off their week, and then you can have your phone call scheduled so that you're checking in with them to get an idea of what they accomplished that day to make sure that they're engaging with the content that you're sending home. Low tech, same thing. The only difference is with this option, you might have email access to your students. Your students might have cell phones, so you could do some group messaging. You could do daily emails, and in those emails, it could be more than just checking in with your students. You could send, have a daily riddle or a content question that they have to respond to, a trivia question, maybe a problem to solve for the day. Any one of those will work to send out on a daily basis. You could also have your students send pictures of the work that they completed and send that to you along with their schedules, what they checked off on their schedules. And again, you're using emails, you're using text, you're using phone calls for also keeping the content or the temp check, weekly temp check going as well. So you can use those options for checking in with your students to make sure they're engaging every day. For medium to high tech, this is where we're adding a possible LMS, which is a learning management system. Whether you might be using Moodle, you're using Google Classroom, you're using Canvas, Schoology, one of those options for your digital platform or your LMS, and you can post daily questions. So when they open up, maybe you have things unpublished in your LMS, and then you could publish them each day that they need to respond to a discussion question, which could be anything. You could have inspirational quotes, you could use articles, current events, web quests, images, videos, songs, quotes, whatever you want them to focus on, but having kind of like a daily exit ticket. So you could either do it at open up, here's the first thing you're going to do in the morning to check in, or do it at the end of the day. But either way, requiring that daily interaction will help you keep those students engaged. Also having a help desk. You could have office hours, keep that help desk, which could look like a discussion post, but it's a help desk that you have for every day that students can ask questions and so forth. And if you have secondary students, some older students, you could take turns assigning students to the help desk to answer questions for other students as well. Another thing associated with daily engagement is goal setting, and this is for any no tech to high tech. If you're able to provide some instruction on some goal setting, that is an extremely effective method for engagement. You can have your students write some SMART goals, and they could be for a unit of content. They could be weekly goals. You could do small goals for daily goal setting with your students, whatever is going to work to keep your students engaged on a daily basis. But having them write those, post them somewhere, share them, take a snapshot, send to you through email, and if they have paper or digital binders that track their progress, their goal progress for that day, for that week, for that unit of study, that's the best option if you can provide some instruction and have them set up for that. And then you could include end of week goal reflections. So they can write, even in their resource packets that they turn into, if they're turning in on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, you can have them talk about their goals, in what went well, what did, what do they need moving forward, additional support from you, and so forth. But they could also email those to you or post in your LMS or digital platform. Virtual session engagement, obviously, with no to low tech, we have very few options, but there is one thing that you can do if your students have, if they're able to utilize their parents' phones, or they have their own phones, and that's it in terms of what technology they have. You could do a free conference with them. And there's a resource we're sharing with you. It's free conference line. So you could set up a conference line where they call into the conference line and you could have a group discussion with them. So you can connect with students, you could host a discussion, you could share some stories, ask content related questions, or just provide some basic direct instruction, whatever they need with their instructional support. For medium to high tech, obviously, we're going to have some more options. And one thing to note with anything, whether you're doing conference calls with the no to low tech or you're doing actual virtual classrooms, spaces set up for class, you should have this in your schedule. So your students need to know when you're going to be meeting with them in this synchronous session, what time it is, what platform you're using, if it's the free conference line, having that number posted in your schedule, if it's going to be a link to your Google Meet or your Zoom classroom, or if you're using Blackboard Class Connect, whatever the case may be, your students need to see on their schedule how to get into that session to meet with you. You could also think out of the box. If your students are really tech savvy and you've been doing things like Twitter and Instagram and things like that with them, you can have some live streaming sessions scheduled for them for direct instruction. And then, of course, if you have an LMS with a built-in conferencing tool, that should always be your first option for your students. So here are some virtual session tips if you're going to be offering these. Whenever you start a session, you always want to make sure you greet your students as they pop into the room. Even if a student is arriving a little bit late and you've started the session, just take a pause and say, hey, so glad that you're joining us today. We were just talking about whatever. And then you want to warm up with an icebreaker. Here's a little remote learning example where you have your students choose an adjective and then they choose that describes their current mood. They add that to the color of the pants they're wearing for that virtual session, and then the last snack that they ate in one sitting that they thought would last an entire week. And that's the name of their band, their COVID-19 band. So in this case, the example is the mellow pink and white Pringles. So that's what you do. And there's tons of icebreakers. If you just do a quick Google search, icebreakers with students, you'd find a plethora of ideas to open up that are just fun, kind of get them warmed up, get them talking, and so forth. You could also share a Padlet wall and have students post an image, respond to a favorite quote. Hey, give me a quote for a day. What could we, give us something inspirational or something totally funny or whatever, and obviously make sure you talk about appropriateness of your content, especially with your older students, as you get ready to get that Padlet wall up and running. And the nice thing about Padlet wall is you can monitor what's being posted before it actually is posted live. So you could be in there with the Padlet wall with them. You could flip it. You could have the Padlet wall, hey, you guys post something that we could start class out with, and then you share that Padlet wall when your session starts to open it up. You could play music. I know some, some digital classrooms. I know like Blackboard Class Connect. You could load your music right into the session. If you don't have that capability, you could be playing music in the background, whatever the case is. You could have students choose a song that they want to start the next session out with, and have them be involved in picking that, because they'll be excited about, hey, I know my teacher's going to be playing my favorite song during that next session, and they'll be more motivated to attend your session. Comic strips, impactful images, and so forth. You could also have them start with sharing a story of gratitude. What's one thing you're thankful for today? Or you can end a session that way. But just get really creative in how you open your sessions. You don't just want to say, hey, glad you're all here, and then jump right into instruction. So during the class, building on content. Once you warm them up, you should always review some content. Quick Q&A session. What are you struggling with? What's going really well? How can what do you need from me? How can your peers help you? Whatever the case may be, but get a Q&A session going. And this is, again, you could flip it. You could have a Padlet wall set up where they post their question that they want to address as soon as the session starts, and you've got that Padlet wall ready to go as soon as you get to the review session and that virtual session is running. Moving on to direct instruction, really think of a multimedia approach and keep your instruction brief. You don't want to sit there, students don't want to sit and get when they're in the physical classroom. They don't want to sit and get in a virtual classroom. Lectures only go so far with the attention span. So be creative, use images, use videos, commercials, anything that would really express the theme of what you're talking about. Use your whiteboard tools to demonstrate and interact with students. You could even have a live whiteboard using Trello or Twidla, something like that. And your students could be interacting on the virtual whiteboard while you're holding the session. So that way, you're simulating what you would do in a regular classroom. And really engage your learners in the lesson. So once you have your review session, you do a little bit of instruction, then you want to empower your students. You want to hand it over to them. You can, this is show what you know. So you could create scavenger hunts. You could use web quests. You could take a virtual tour or go on a virtual field trip. And we have tons of resources we're sharing with this week's video. Play a game with your students. You could even host a debate, get something going. Think current events and pick your teams on two sides of that debate, or do a spider web discussion, something like that. Make use of your breakout rooms. If you have that option with the tool, the digital space that you're using, set up your breakout rooms for small discussions, collaboration, brainstorming, group writing, problem solving, or games. I know the breakout rooms, you could load presentations. Blackboard Class Connect is an example of that, where you could actually have whiteboards with different slides, and then the students can type on the slides and interact with the content. If you don't have that capability, I know Zoom is an example where they just have basic breakout room set up, and every student could be in there talking to each other. You could still have a virtual white wall. They could be collaborating on that white wall during that conversation that they're having in that room. You could pop in to those rooms to moderate those discussions, or you can also assign moderators depending on the age of your students in each of those breakout rooms as well. If you utilize a breakout room, I recommend having an exit ticket. So they're not just in there, talking, chit-chatting, and things like that, which is really important, and you've got to have time set aside for that in the class. But during that session, if you really want them working on a task, then you need to make sure that you have some type of exit ticket. Maybe they're collaborating in a Google document, and so they each use a different color for the ideas that they're sharing. And so, Jenny is green and Mark is purple, so that way they're putting their name, their color, and they're showing you what they contributed to that collaborative process, whatever that might be. In this way, it also holds everybody accountable. And if you're able to, um, give points for what your students are doing. So if there's a quiz and you're able to do some type of group learning and you could see, assess them collaboratively on the same content instead of doing an individual quiz, use that. And if it in obviously if they're showing mastery of that content individually or collaboratively, then you could say, hey, you just earned your points for this particular assessment, and that's going to keep them motivated to come to your sessions as well. And then when you're done, bring everybody back into your main room, wrap up, discuss, summarize, whatever the case may be. Maybe you have each student moderator from the groups for your older students, of course, summarize their research findings or read their group writing, whatever the case may be. And then you should always launch your students. So, think creatively for this as well. Just like you open up fun, think of a really cool ending for your course to send them on their way. You could have exit tickets. You could have them respond to a quote, image, song, video. I always would have my students post something that, okay, everybody search for an image for whatever, connected to the theme of what we discussed today, or search for a motivational quote that connects, or a song lyric that connects, or something like that. So you really want to think with them connecting what they learned, to give them purpose for that session. Other tips, flip it. We talked a little bit about that, so as many things as you could share prior to the session that you're holding, the better, because then you're going to be really efficient with your time. You could do more hands-on, collaborative work with your students during that time. So think about that. Schedule themes for your sessions. So especially this works with your younger kids, or even older kids, depending on what you want to do, how goofy you could get with them. But, funny hat day, bring your pet to class day, wear your favorite sports team attire, bring a stuffed animal, don your cool sunglasses or best concert ever t-shirt, whatever the case may be. And for elementary teachers, when you're doing sessions, you could really entertain your students, using stuffed animals, puppets, have a show and tell day, host story time, sing a song to start a class or end a class. And then at the end, always survey your students. What went well with the session? What would you like to see with the next session, so that you get some feedback from them to keep them engaged in what they're learning during that virtual time. Now moving on to content engagement for no to low tech, try to integrate some gamification elements into your learning packets. You could include Easter eggs or embed clues connected to what the students are learning. And then you could award some badges to your students. So when the next set of packets go home, they're getting a badge for what they created or what they accomplished with the last resource packet. For medium to high tech, utilize educational sites for gamification. Some really, really good ones are Minecraft for education and Classcraft, if you want to look into those, and we provide links to those resources. Another thing that is gaining a lot of popularity are digital escape rooms. So think about creating a digital escape room for a unit of study, and we have an article on how to do that. Or create your own games, or even have your students create a challenge for each other, if you have older students. And then badge your students. So if you're using a learning management system with Schoology, like Schoology for instance, badges are built into that. If not, a great resource is Badger or Open Badge.me is another great resource for creating digital badges and sharing those digital badges with your students for what they accomplish. Also, having students contribute to learning, and this is primarily, some older students would be more involved in this, but doing blogs, having them monitor a blog, create a blog discussion based on what they're learning, and facilitate that blog discussion. Same thing with discussion boards. So if you don't want to use a blog like EduBlog, you could use the discussion board tools within your LMS or digital platform. Instructional videos and podcasts. Have students create a video working through a particular problem, or doing a lab that other students could do at home, and so they demonstrate a lab with household materials that you don't have to purchase, and then they share that with the students and other students do the lab. Podcasts, they can record a podcast on content to share with students. And then video messages, Marco Polo app. I know some students, secondary students, are using that in their classes to communicate with each other and send messages. Flipgrid is another one. It's kind of like a film strip of videos, and this could be used, with students recording a response, a video response to something. And then everybody can even comment on the videos, but you'll see a long film strip of all the videos from the students, and then you could comment on those videos as well. Also, make content relatable. Obviously, current events, with everything going on right now, supply and demand of toilet paper, 5 activities you could do at home during this time, and do a video that entertains students. Debates, working statistics into math, journal events. You could even do a photo journal of what's happening right now. Writing thank yous to our first responders and frontline medical staff, and having those sent out to to staff at a particular hospital or something like that. Making a documentary. Public service announcement. And then for elementary, just for some basic things, like think about making the content relevant. What do they have available to them at home? If you're talking about shapes, having them find objects in the house that represent different shapes, and then they could do like a Flipgrid video, like where they're showing the shapes, or bring those shapes to a virtual session, those objects to a virtual session, take photographs of them, whatever the case may be, and however it's relevant to the age of your students, obviously. ELL students, for our English language learners, you could think of having them place names on items around the house to practice their English, and then do the same thing with demonstrating that understanding. Cross-curricular ideas. This is one example. If you've ever heard of the game Pandemic, you can form teams of students and assign them each a country. And then, of course, some of the directions are located on the slide. I won't go over it, but it kind of lets you think outside the box. So it doesn't, we don't have to be individual teachers on our little content islands and everybody's doing their own thing. Talk to your colleagues in your department. Think about doing a project-based learning activity that's cross-curricular with your students. It may be something that's current. We provide some resources for some ideas with that. And they're project-based learning. So, you could utilize all the different virtual tools that we're sharing during the session for the collaborative part of the work. You could have an expert of judges that will be assessing your students' projects at the end of that PBL unit of study. Students can present live during a synchronous session. They could do that virtually, or you could have them record presentations to share regarding their projects, whatever the case may be, that is relevant, of course, to your content in the age of your students. But we do have some resources, so you could check out project-based learning. And then finally, the last thing is celebrating your students. So make sure you have a place to acknowledge your students' awesomeness. So even if you're low tech and you're using resource packets, email, phone, snail mail, whatever the case may be, highlight how amazing they are. Acknowledging grit at a time like this. Share those messages through email, through group texting, and acknowledge a student that way. You can mail thank yous to your students to show your appreciation for how hard they're working during this difficult time. Or make a personalized Voki or Smile box, and we do link those digital tools. But they're a very cool way to kind of share a special message with a student, just to acknowledge that individual. For mid to high tech, you could produce a virtual wow wall. So you could do that in your LMS, you could do it, or your digital classroom. If you have a website built for your students, you could have a virtual wall built on that website, or your virtual classroom wall, maybe a Padlet. And basically you're highlighting students' work and have other students acknowledge each other. You could choose a new student each week to recognize when you share the week's schedule of work. and have that go out to everybody. And then you could use virtual sessions, of course, to highlight a student, and be sure to send a formal invitation to that individual so he or she knows that that special recognition is going to be built into that session. And so, just a final thought, remote learning can keep students engaged, and that is really our goal. So, this little funny thing here from Reader's Digest: my students don't remember my lessons, and we don't want to be this person. So, we want to make sure that our students are fully engaged, not just on, we're talking daily engagement, but they're engaged in the virtual sessions that you hold, as well as engaging with their content as well. So that is what we are always striving for. So I just want to thank you for watching this week's video on student engagement in remote learning environments. For upcoming videos, we have relationship building. We'll be covering assessment, feedback, and data collection, digital platform do's and don'ts. And if you don't see something on this list that you would like a session on, please reach out to us. In the description for this video, you will see a link to a resource document, and that link has our personal contact information, all of ILC's important links, including its remote learning resource packet, as well as today's webinar resources will be in there. So you could take a look at the tabs at the bottom of that spreadsheet for all of that information. If you haven't already, you'll want to make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you are kept up to date on all of our postings.